Hey guys, tonight we're looking at something deceptively ordinary, but absolutely central to the Roman world. Not a famous battle, not a triumph, not an emperor, just food. Because the Roman army did not conquer, hold, and organize a vast empire on courage alone. It moved on its stomach. And once you start asking what Roman soldiers actually ate, a much bigger story begins to appear. A story about discipline, logistics, agriculture, class, empire, and the everyday habits that made Roman military power possible. And if you enjoy calm, carefully researched history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular viewers do, simply so they don't miss future deep dives into the quieter parts of the past that often explain the most. To understand what Roman soldiers ate, we first need to clear away a modern misconception. It is easy to imagine the Roman army as a force fed by a centralized military machine, with standard rations arriving in neat, predictable quantities from state warehouses. In reality, the Roman army was organized, but it was also deeply dependent on local supply, seasonal availability, and the practical limits of transport. Roman soldiers lived in forts, marched across provinces, campaigned in hostile territory, and garrisoned frontiers from Britain to Syria. Their diet had common foundations, but it was never identical everywhere. Changed by region, by season, by campaign, and by rank. Even so, one fact stands above all the rest. The basic food of the Roman soldier was grain. Grain mattered more than meat, more than wine, and more than any luxury item that later writers like to mention. Wheat especially sat at the center of the Roman military diet. Roman commanders, administrators, and writers repeatedly treated grain supply as one of the decisive practical questions of warfare. An army that had grain could function. An army that lost access to grain quickly became vulnerable, no matter how experienced or disciplined it might be. Soldiers might receive their grain whole and then grind it themselves, or it might be issued in a more prepared form depending on circumstance. But the central point remains the same. Roman military nutrition began not with roasts or feasts, but with cereals. That tells us something important about the Roman army itself. However glamorous Roman military history can seem from a distance, the daily reality was built on habits that were repetitive, plain, and labor-intensive. Grain had to be transported, stored, protected from moisture, measured out, milled, and cooked. Soldiers often carried part of this burden themselves. They were fighters, but they were also workers inside a vast system of organized labor. In camp life and on campaign, they baked bread, made porridge, prepared simple meals, and relied on food that was durable rather than exciting. That durability was the whole point. Armies do not survive on delicacy. They survive on reliability. A Roman soldier's most familiar meal would likely have looked quite modest to modern eyes. Bread in some form was common, as were porridges and grain mash. Pulse, a porridge-like preparation with deep roots in Roman food culture, had long been associated with earlier Roman simplicity, and while elite literary sources sometimes used such foods to talk about old Roman virtue, the practical appeal is obvious enough. Grain could be boiled, stretched, shared, and adapted, could feed many men with relative efficiency. Bread, meanwhile, offered portability. In settled forts, soldiers could use ovens and more regular cooking arrangements. On campaign, meals had to match movement and uncertainty. Alongside grain came legumes, especially beans and lentils. These were valuable because they stored well and added nutritional variety to a diet that otherwise risked becoming monotonous. Roman military sites have produced evidence of pulses, and this fits neatly with what we know about Roman food more broadly. Legumes were affordable, practical, and familiar across the empire. They were not glamorous, but they were useful. That matters because the Roman army, for all its prestige, was not designed around comfort. It was designed around sustainability. Then there was meat, which tends to receive more attention than it probably deserves in popular imagination. Roman soldiers certainly ate meat. Archaeological evidence from forts across the empire shows the remains of cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and sometimes wild animals. In some regions, pork seems to have been especially common. Bacon and salted meats also had clear advantages for storage and transport. But meat was not necessarily the stable centerpiece of every soldier's daily ration in the way modern audiences sometimes assume. It was important, but it sat within a broader food system dominated by grain. Meat availability could rise or fall depending on local resources, supply arrangements, and whether an army was campaigning or settled. This is where archaeology becomes especially valuable, because it helps correct the biases of literary sources. Ancient authors often wrote from elite perspectives, and elite Romans could be surprisingly moralizing about food. Simplicity could be praised as a sign of old discipline, while luxury could be condemned as a sign of decline. But bones, charred seeds, storage jars, cooking vessels, and latrine remains tell a less rhetorical story. They show us what ended up being eaten in real places by real communities. From military forts in northern Europe to installations on imperial frontiers, the evidence suggests diets that were practical, adaptable, and more varied than a single neat ration list would suggest. Roman soldiers also consumed cheese, which again made practical sense. Cheese could be nutritious, transportable, and easier to preserve than fresh milk. Olive oil was another important element, especially in Mediterranean contexts, though its availability and prominence could vary by region. Oil mattered not just for cooking but as a calorie-rich staple within Roman food culture more generally. Vinegar, often mixed with water into a drink commonly associated with the lower ranks and ordinary laborers, also appears in discussions of Roman military life. This drink, often called pasca in later references, was not a luxury beverage. It was functional, refreshing in diluted form, and safer than questionable water in some circumstances. Wine, too, belonged to the Roman military world, though again we should imagine ordinary use more than luxury consumption. Wine was often diluted. Its quality could vary enormously. The army reflected Roman society, and Roman society recognized major differences between elite dining and everyday nourishment. The rank-and-file soldier was not dining like a senator. Even when the military had access to wine and meat, those items entered a culture of rationing, management, and hierarchy. Officers could expect better conditions than ordinary soldiers. Status shaped diet, just as it shaped almost every other part of Roman life. One of the most revealing things about Roman military food is how much it depended on infrastructure. The Roman Empire is often admired for roads, bridges, ports, and administrative order, and military diet helps explain why those things mattered so much. Food had to move. Grain from one region might support troops in another. Herds, carts, pack animals, ships, warehouses, mills, and bakers all formed part of the military machine. Campaigning armies could forage, requisition supplies, or seize food, but these methods were risky and often unpopular. A truly effective army needed planned supply. In that sense, what Roman soldiers ate was inseparable from how Rome governed territory. This also helps explain why frontiers mattered economically as much as militarily. A permanent garrison on the Rhine or in Britain was not just a line of defense. It was a consumer population that needed constant feeding. Local farmers, merchants, contractors, and transport workers became tied to military demand. Forts were not isolated islands. They were deeply connected to surrounding landscapes and economies. Soldiers ate what empire could move, what provinces could grow, and what local markets could provide. Over time, that encouraged cultural exchange as well. Foods common in one region could travel with troops, merchants, or administrators into another. So when we ask what Roman soldiers ate, the answer is not merely wheat, beans, pork, cheese, oil, and sour wine. The deeper answer is that Roman soldiers ate the empire itself, in the sense that their food came from a political and logistical system stretching across continents. Every loaf, every ration, every slaughtered animal reflected roads maintained, taxes gathered, contracts enforced, storehouses guarded, and harvests counted. The Roman army's diet was not an afterthought. It was one of the foundations of imperial power. And yet daily eating was still personal. However large the system became, the meal itself remained small and immediate. A few men around a cooking fire, grain being ground by hand, bread being baked in camp conditions, salted meat cut into portions, a pot of legumes simmering, perhaps olive oil, perhaps vinegar mixed with water, perhaps a little wine. For the ordinary soldier, food was not an abstract matter of state capacity. It was energy for the march, relief after labor, and the difference between order and weakness. Hunger undermines discipline very quickly. A fed army can endure a great deal. Rome understood that. There is also a moral dimension here, and the Romans themselves would have recognized it. Roman writers admired military toughness, restraint, and endurance. Whether or not the past was ever as austere as they claimed, they liked to believe that Rome's greatness had been built by men willing to live plainly. In that imagination, simple food became a symbol of virtue. Bread, porridge, and modest rations were not signs of poverty alone. They were signs of discipline. Later fears about moral decline were often expressed through food, especially when luxury seemed to replace hardness. So the Roman soldier's diet carried ideological weight as well as nutritional value. Still, we should be careful not to turn that into myth. Roman soldiers did not eat simply because simplicity was noble. They ate simply because armies need dependable food. Ideals of discipline came afterward, layered onto the practical world of supply and survival. That is often the pattern in history. Material necessity comes first, and cultural meaning gathers around it later. By looking closely at military diet, we end up seeing Rome more clearly. Not just its armies in battle, but its farms, workshops, roads, markets, and frontier settlements. Not just its commanders, but its bakers, drovers, millers, and laborers. The Roman army was effective in part because it made ordinary things systematic. And among those ordinary things, food may have been the most important of all. So the next time you picture a Roman soldier, it may be worth imagining not the clash of shields, but the quieter scene that made that clash possible in the first place. Grain sacks unloaded at a fort, bread prepared before dawn, a cooking pot over a low fire, and a meal plain enough to be forgotten by most ancient historians, but essential enough to help sustain one of the most successful military forces in history. Behind every Roman fort, march, and campaign stood a constant calculation. How to keep thousands of soldiers fed, day after day, across enormous distances. Grain might have been the foundation of the Roman soldier's diet, but that grain did not magically appear inside military camps. It had to be produced somewhere, harvested by farmers, collected through taxation or purchase, and transported through an intricate network that stretched across the empire. In many provinces, the Roman state relied on a mixture of systems. Some grain arrived as tax from agricultural regions. Provinces that produced large harvests could be required to supply the army stationed within their borders or even troops stationed elsewhere. In other cases, the military purchased supplies directly from local producers. Contractors, merchants, and transport workers became essential partners in this process. The Roman army was powerful, but it still depended on civilian labor and rural productivity. An army on campaign could sometimes live off the land for a time, but long-term occupation demanded stable supply lines. Once grain reached a military installation, it had to be stored carefully. Archaeologists studying Roman forts have found large granaries designed specifically for this purpose. These buildings were constructed with raised floors to allow air to circulate underneath, helping keep the grain dry and preventing rot. Ventilation and careful design reduced the risk of mold and pests. Even small mistakes in storage could mean losing huge quantities of food, and that kind of loss could threaten the stability of a garrison. Roman engineers therefore treated granaries with the same seriousness they gave to walls or watchtowers. Inside the fort, soldiers themselves played a role in turning raw grain into meals. Roman soldiers were not simply handed prepared food each day. They were expected to handle part of the work. Small groups of soldiers, often organized within their living units, shared cooking duties. Grain could be ground using hand mills, producing flour that could then be baked into bread or prepared as a thick porridge. This routine was part of daily military life. Alongside training, maintenance, and guard duty, food preparation was simply another task that disciplined soldiers performed together. The presence of ovens inside many Roman forts shows how organized this process could become. In permanent camps especially, communal baking facilities allowed large numbers of soldiers to prepare bread efficiently. The smell of baking grain must have been a familiar part of garrison life, particularly in colder frontier regions where warm food was welcome after long hours of patrol or construction work. And that brings us to another important point. Roman soldiers did not spend all their time fighting. Much of their life was spent building roads, repairing walls, digging defenses, transporting supplies, and maintaining infrastructure. All of that labor required energy. The steady supply of grain-based meals helped sustain the physical workload expected of Roman troops. In this sense, the diet of the Roman soldier was closely tied to the broader military culture of discipline, endurance, and practical efficiency. As Roman armies expanded across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, their diet also began to reflect the incredible geographic diversity of the empire. While grain remained the backbone of military nutrition, the foods that supplemented it often depended on the local landscape. Soldiers stationed along the Rhine or Danube might eat somewhat differently from those serving in North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean. Climate, agriculture, and trade routes all shaped what ended up on a soldier's plate. In the northern provinces, for example, animal husbandry played a large role in the local economy. Archaeological excavations at forts in Britain and Germany frequently uncover the bones of cattle, pigs, and sheep. Pork appears particularly common, and this fits well with Roman tastes more broadly. Salted pork and bacon could be preserved and transported more easily than fresh meat, making them practical for military use. At the same time, cattle were valuable not only for meat but also for labor and dairy products, meaning they might be slaughtered less frequently unless the circumstances required it. Sheep and goats added another dimension to the military diet. These animals could provide both meat and milk, and from that milk came cheese, which was a durable and nutritious food. Cheese traveled well, kept longer than fresh dairy, and added protein and fat to meals that might otherwise rely heavily on grain. For soldiers enduring long marches or working in harsh weather, these extra calories mattered. In the Mediterranean regions of the empire, olive oil became far more prominent. Olive groves were widespread in southern Italy, Greece, and parts of North Africa and the Near East, and oil served as one of the most important staples of Roman cuisine. For soldiers stationed in these regions, oil could be used for cooking, flavoring, or even simply adding calories to otherwise simple meals. Oil was also transported in large ceramic containers called amphorae, many of which have been discovered in military contexts across the empire. Vegetables and herbs also appeared in the Roman soldiers' world, though they are harder for historians to track because plant remains rarely survive as clearly as bones or pottery. However, charred seeds and pollen found in archaeological layers suggest that Roman soldiers consumed foods such as onions, garlic, cabbage, and other common vegetables. These ingredients added flavor to otherwise simple meals and helped prevent diets from becoming entirely repetitive. Garlic, in particular, had a long association with soldiers and laborers in ancient societies. Ancient writers sometimes described it as a food of the working classes, valued for its strong taste and believed health benefits. Whether or not those benefits were fully understood, garlic and similar ingredients would have helped make basic grain dishes more satisfying. Fruit could also appear when available. Apples, figs, grapes, and other fruits were widely cultivated across the Roman world. Fresh fruit would have been seasonal, but dried fruit could travel longer distances and last through colder months. Dried figs and raisins, for instance, were calorie-rich and easy to store, making them useful additions to military supplies. Another interesting aspect of Roman military diet appears when we examine the trash deposits of forts. Ancient latrines, rubbish pits, and abandoned storage areas sometimes preserve the remains of everyday life in remarkable detail. Archaeologists have recovered fish bones, shellfish remains, fruit seeds, and small animal bones from such locations. These discoveries reveal that soldiers occasionally enjoyed foods that went beyond basic rations. Fish, for example, could be caught locally or transported preserved in salt. In coastal areas or near rivers, fish might have appeared fairly regularly. Yet even with this variety, it is important to remember that the Roman soldier's diet was designed around reliability, not luxury. Meals were meant to keep men healthy enough to march, build, and fight. Variety appeared when circumstances allowed it, but the core structure remained consistent across centuries of Roman military history. Grain first, supplements second. This practical approach to food also reinforced one of the Roman army's most important qualities: standardization. Roman commanders believed that discipline grew from routine. Soldiers marched in formation, built camps according to consistent designs, followed established chains of command, and maintained predictable daily schedules. Eating habits fit into this larger pattern. While the exact ingredients could vary, the rhythm of meals and the expectation of self-sufficiency remained remarkably stable. Even on campaign, Roman soldiers were trained to carry part of their own food supply. Grain rations might be distributed before a march, and soldiers were responsible for transporting them along with their weapons, armor, and tools. This practice reduced dependence on supply wagons and allowed armies to move with greater flexibility. It also meant that each soldier had a personal stake in protecting and managing his own provisions. Carrying food may sound like a small detail, but it reflects a broader truth about Roman military success. The Roman army was not simply a collection of brave fighters. It was a system built on preparation, organization, and attention to practical details. Food logistics were as important to victory as tactics or weaponry. When historians look at the rise and longevity of Roman power, they often point to roads, engineering, law, and administration. But beneath all of those achievements lies something more basic: the ability to feed large numbers of people in difficult conditions for very long periods of time. Armies march on their stomachs, as the famous saying goes, and the Roman army proved that truth again and again across centuries of expansion. So when we imagine the daily life of a Roman soldier, the picture should include not only shields and standards, but also hand mills grinding grain, ovens warming in the early morning, amphorae of oil stacked in storage rooms, and the steady rhythm of simple meals shared among men who depended on one another for survival. Because long before a Roman legion raised its banners on the battlefield, its soldiers had already gathered around something far more ordinary: a loaf of bread, a pot of grain, and the quiet work of preparing the food that made the empire possible. Food in the Roman army was also closely tied to discipline and military identity. Roman commanders believed that the habits of daily life shaped the effectiveness of soldiers just as much as training with weapons. Eating simple, predictable meals reinforced the idea that soldiers were part of a professional force built on endurance and restraint. Luxury, in contrast, was often treated with suspicion. Several Roman writers warned that excessive comfort could weaken military character, and food was one of the areas where this concern appeared most clearly. Roman historians sometimes contrasted the supposedly modest diet of earlier soldiers with what they described as the growing indulgence of later generations. Whether these comparisons were fully accurate or partly nostalgic exaggeration is still debated by historians. Ancient authors often looked back at the past with admiration and used stories of simplicity to criticize their own time. But even if these accounts contain some exaggeration, they still reveal something important about Roman values. Simplicity in food became a symbol of discipline, and discipline was seen as the foundation of Roman military strength. The daily structure of meals inside a Roman fort also helped strengthen social bonds between soldiers. Most soldiers did not cook alone. Instead, they lived and ate in small groups known as contubernia, usually consisting of about 8 men who shared living quarters and daily responsibilities. These groups functioned almost like miniature households within the larger army. They slept in the same barracks room, stored equipment together, and worked together during routine tasks. When it came time to prepare food, members of the contubernium cooperated. One soldier might grind grain, another might tend the fire, and another might prepare ingredients. Cooking was therefore not only about nutrition but also about teamwork. Sharing meals helped reinforce trust among men who might later depend on each other during dangerous situations in battle. Inside many Roman forts, archaeologists have discovered small hearths, cooking pots, and grinding stones associated with these living spaces. These discoveries provide a glimpse into the ordinary routines that rarely appear in ancient texts. While historians often focus on generals and campaigns, the daily life of soldiers unfolded in these small, repetitive actions: grinding grain, boiling porridge, baking bread, and dividing food among companions. Another interesting aspect of Roman military diet appears when we examine how the army adapted during long campaigns. When legions marched into unfamiliar territories, they could not always rely on established supply networks. In those moments, soldiers and commanders had to depend more heavily on local resources. This process could take several forms. Armies might purchase food from nearby communities, negotiate supply arrangements with local leaders, or gather provisions through organized foraging. Foraging was a risky strategy and usually required careful supervision. Sending soldiers out to gather food exposed them to ambush or conflict with local populations. Roman commanders therefore tried to balance the need for supplies with the need for security. When possible, they preferred structured supply systems rather than uncontrolled scavenging. Still, the ability to adapt to local food sources remained an important skill for armies operating far from their permanent bases. In some regions, Roman soldiers encountered foods that were unfamiliar to them. Over time, these encounters could lead to changes in diet. The Roman Empire was a vast network of cultural exchange, and soldiers were often among the first people to encounter new agricultural products. As troops moved between provinces, they carried habits and tastes with them. Markets near military forts often reflected this mixture of influences, offering foods from different parts of the empire. For example, soldiers stationed in Britain during the first centuries of Roman rule likely encountered local agricultural traditions alongside Roman imports. Archaeological evidence from British forts suggests the presence of foods such as barley, oats, and local vegetables alongside more traditionally Mediterranean items like olive oil. These combinations show how Roman military communities blended local and imperial food cultures. This blending also reminds us that Roman forts were not isolated from civilian life. Around many forts, small settlements known as vici developed over time. These communities included merchants, craftsmen, families of soldiers, and local farmers who provided goods and services to the garrison. Food markets in these settlements allowed soldiers to supplement their rations with additional items if they had the money to do so. A soldier with extra pay might purchase fresh meat, vegetables, fruit, or other foods that went beyond the standard ration. In this way, personal wealth and rank could influence diet even within the structured environment of the army. Officers, who earned higher pay and held higher status, often had access to better meals and more comfortable dining arrangements. Yet despite these differences, the central pattern of the Roman military diet remained remarkably consistent across centuries. Grain-based meals, supported by legumes, meat when available, cheese, oil, and occasional wine formed the nutritional backbone of Roman military life. These foods were not chosen because they were luxurious or exciting. They were chosen because they worked. They could be grown in large quantities. They could be transported across long distances. They could be stored for months without spoiling. And most importantly, they could sustain the physical demands placed on soldiers who marched hundreds of miles, built fortifications, and fought in some of the most demanding conditions of the ancient world. In many ways, the Roman soldier's diet represents a perfect example of Roman practicality. The empire did not survive for centuries because of dramatic moments alone. It survived because countless ordinary systems, roads, administration, taxation, engineering, and food supply, functioned reliably day after day. Every loaf of bread baked in a military oven, every sack of grain unloaded at a frontier fort, and every shared meal inside a barracks room contributed quietly to the stability of the Roman world. And when we look closely at those small details, we begin to see something remarkable. The strength of Rome did not come only from its armies in battle. It came from the systems that fed those armies, sustained their discipline, and supported their daily lives across one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. In other words, the story of what Roman soldiers ate is not just a story about food. It is a story about how an empire learned to organize the ordinary parts of life so effectively that those ordinary routines could support extraordinary power. There is another aspect of the Roman soldier's diet that historians find especially revealing, and that is the connection between food and mobility. Roman armies were famous for their ability to move long distances quickly and in organized formations. But moving thousands of men across provinces was never simply a question of marching. It was also a question of feeding them along the way. An army that could not maintain its food supply would slow down, weaken, and eventually lose its ability to fight effectively. For that reason, Roman military planning often began with logistics rather than battlefield tactics. Commanders needed to understand where food could be obtained, how far supplies could travel, and how long stored rations would last. Campaign routes were frequently shaped by rivers, farmland, and existing settlements that could support the passage of troops. Even the famous Roman road system, admired for its engineering precision, played a role in maintaining the steady movement of food and other supplies. Soldiers themselves carried part of this burden. Roman troops were well known for marching with heavy equipment, which included not only weapons and armor but also tools and personal gear. Ancient writers sometimes described soldiers carrying poles across their shoulders with packs attached, a system that allowed them to transport their belongings efficiently. Among those belongings could be several days' worth of grain. This practice reduced the immediate pressure on supply wagons and allowed armies to operate more independently when necessary. Carrying grain rather than finished bread also had practical advantages. Whole grain stored better than baked bread and was less likely to spoil during long journeys. Once soldiers stopped to make camp, they could grind the grain using portable hand mills and prepare fresh food. This routine fit naturally into the Roman military habit of constructing temporary camps at the end of each day's march. These camps were not random gatherings of tents but carefully planned defensive spaces, built with ditches, ramparts, and organized streets. Inside these camps, the daily rhythm of cooking and eating could begin again. The process of preparing food after a long march might have been slow and tiring, but it also offered a moment of stability. Fires were lit, grain was milled, and simple meals were cooked while guards watched the perimeter. For soldiers who spent weeks or months on campaign, these routines created a sense of continuity even in unfamiliar landscapes. Food preparation, like camp construction, was part of the discipline that defined Roman military life. Another important element of Roman military nutrition was salt. Salt was essential for preserving meat, but it also played a role in maintaining health, especially for soldiers performing hard physical labor. In warm climates or during long marches, the body loses salt through sweat. While ancient people did not understand the full science behind this process, they recognized the importance of salt in daily life. Roman supply systems therefore included access to salt sources, either through trade routes or through local production in certain regions. Salted foods were especially valuable during campaigns. Meat preserved with salt could last much longer than fresh meat, making it a practical source of protein when other supplies were uncertain. Salted fish products were also widely used across the Roman world. One of the most famous examples is garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans used as a seasoning. While garum was sometimes associated with urban markets and elite cuisine, simpler fish products likely appeared in military contexts as well, particularly near coastal areas or river systems where fishing was common. Water, of course, was equally essential. Roman soldiers needed reliable access to drinking water wherever they traveled. Rivers, wells, and springs were therefore important considerations when choosing camp locations. In some cases, the Roman army even constructed wells inside fortified camps to ensure a dependable supply. Clean water was crucial not only for drinking but also for cooking grain and other foods. To make water safer or more pleasant to drink, soldiers sometimes mixed it with vinegar, creating the diluted beverage often associated with the Roman army. This drink, known as pasca, had several advantages. The vinegar helped mask unpleasant tastes and may have offered mild antibacterial benefits. It also provided a refreshing flavor during hot conditions. While pasca was not considered a luxury drink, it became closely associated with the practical daily life of soldiers and laborers throughout the Roman world. The importance of food in maintaining military strength also appears in Roman military law and discipline. Soldiers were expected to protect their rations carefully and avoid waste. Losing supplies through negligence could have serious consequences for an entire unit. Commanders therefore enforced strict rules about storage, distribution, and consumption of food. In an environment where survival depended on organization, carelessness with provisions was not taken lightly. At the same time, successful commanders understood the psychological value of food. After a difficult march or a successful campaign, extra rations or special meals could be distributed as a reward. These moments of improved diet might include additional meat, better wine, or locally obtained foods that broke the monotony of ordinary rations. Such gestures helped maintain morale and reminded soldiers that their efforts were recognized. Over time, the Roman army developed a reputation for being one of the most disciplined and resilient military forces of the ancient world. Weapons, training, and leadership all played a role in that reputation, but so did the quiet reliability of the Roman supply system. Soldiers who knew that their food would arrive on time could focus on their duties with greater confidence. When historians examine the remains of Roman forts, camps, and supply depots, they often find evidence of careful planning behind even the smallest details. Storage rooms are arranged logically. Granaries are protected from moisture. Cooking areas are positioned within living quarters. Waste disposal areas are organized away from food preparation zones. These patterns show that Roman military planners understood how essential food management was to the stability of their forces. In the end, the story of what Roman soldiers ate reveals something deeper than a simple list of ingredients. It reveals the everyday mechanisms that allowed a vast empire to function. Feeding thousands of soldiers across distant provinces required coordination between farmers, merchants, administrators, engineers, and military officers. Every stage of that system had to work reliably for the army to remain effective. And when those soldiers finally sat down after a long day of marching, building, or guarding the frontier, their meal may have looked quite simple. Bread made from freshly ground grain, pot of beans or lentils, perhaps a portion of salted pork or cheese, a splash of olive oil, and a cup of diluted wine or vinegar water. Simple food, prepared in ordinary ways. Yet those ordinary meals sustained the men who guarded Rome's borders, built its roads, and carried its authority across 3 continents. In that quiet, repetitive act of eating, the strength of the Roman Empire was renewed day after day, one shared meal at a time. Another way historians understand the Roman soldier's diet is by studying the physical remains left behind in military settlements. Roman forts across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa have provided an enormous amount of archaeological evidence about daily life. While ancient writers occasionally mention food in passing, it is often the discarded objects of ordinary life that reveal the most accurate picture of what soldiers actually consumed. One of the most valuable sources of information comes from ancient rubbish pits and latrines. These places preserved items that would normally disappear over time: animal bones, seeds, fruit pits, shells, and fragments of cooking vessels. When archaeologists carefully examine these deposits, they can reconstruct patterns of diet with surprising precision. In many Roman forts, these remains show a consistent pattern, a foundation of grain-based foods supported by a mixture of meat, legumes, vegetables, and occasional fish. For example, excavations at Roman military sites in Britain have revealed a wide range of food remains. At places like Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists have uncovered bones from cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens. Fish bones have also appeared in the deposits, suggesting that soldiers occasionally supplemented their rations with locally caught fish or preserved fish products transported through trade networks. In addition, plant remains have shown the presence of foods such as barley, wheat, coriander, dill, and other herbs. These discoveries remind us that Roman military communities were not isolated outposts cut off from local resources. Instead, they often became part of regional economies. Farmers living near forts could sell livestock, vegetables, and grain to the soldiers stationed nearby. Over time, this relationship encouraged the growth of local markets and settlements. The military presence created steady demand for food, and nearby communities benefited from supplying that demand. In many places, the connection between soldiers and local producers was strengthened by the development of small towns outside the walls of Roman forts. These settlements, often called vici, were home to traders, craftsmen, and families connected to the military community. Food markets in these areas offered soldiers opportunities to purchase items that were not included in their official rations. Fresh fruit, vegetables, additional meat, or locally prepared foods could all appear in these markets. This extra food was not always available to every soldier equally. Rank and income played a role. Officers received higher pay and often had servants or assistants who could prepare better meals. Some officers even maintained private dining arrangements that were far more comfortable than the shared cooking spaces used by ordinary soldiers. These differences reflected the broader social hierarchy of Roman society, where status influenced almost every aspect of daily life. Even so, the gap between officers and ordinary soldiers was not always as dramatic as it might appear in later historical imagination. Roman officers were still part of a military culture that valued practicality and discipline. They might have enjoyed better ingredients or more refined cooking, but they still operated within the logistical limits of military supply systems. Another fascinating piece of evidence comes from written documents discovered at Roman forts. One of the most famous examples is the collection of wooden writing tablets found at Vindolanda. These thin wooden tablets, preserved in waterlogged soil, contain letters, lists, and administrative records written by soldiers and officers nearly 2,000 years ago. Among these documents are references to food supplies and requests for provisions. These small, everyday messages bring the Roman military world to life in remarkable ways. Some tablets record shipments of grain, beer, or other supplies. Others include personal letters mentioning food sent between friends or family members. One famous letter invites a friend to a birthday celebration, suggesting that even on the distant frontier of Britain, social gatherings and shared meals were part of life. The mention of beer in these records is particularly interesting. While wine remained the traditional drink associated with Roman culture, soldiers stationed in northern provinces sometimes adopted local beverages. Beer was widely consumed in parts of Europe long before the Romans arrived. Over time, Roman soldiers serving in these regions appear to have accepted beer as a practical alternative to wine, especially when wine imports were limited or expensive. This adaptation shows how Roman military culture could adjust to local conditions while still maintaining its broader identity. Soldiers brought Roman habits with them, but they also learned from the communities around them. Food traditions moved in both directions. Roman tastes influenced local markets, while local agriculture and cooking practices gradually shaped what soldiers ate. Climate also played an important role in shaping diet. In colder northern regions, soldiers required more calories to maintain energy during harsh winters. Meat and animal fats therefore became more valuable in these areas. In warmer Mediterranean climates, olive oil, vegetables, and lighter meals might appear more frequently. The Roman army's ability to adapt its food supply to different climates was another factor that contributed to its long-term stability. Seasonal change mattered as well. Fresh vegetables and fruits were available at certain times of the year but not others. During winter months, soldiers depended more heavily on preserved foods such as dried legumes, salted meat, cheese, and stored grain. Roman supply systems therefore had to plan months in advance, ensuring that enough food could last through periods when fresh produce was scarce. Preservation techniques were essential in this process. Drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting allowed foods to last much longer than they otherwise would. These methods were widely used across the ancient world, and the Roman army relied on them heavily. Without preservation, feeding large numbers of soldiers across distant provinces would have been far more difficult. Yet even with all this organization, meals themselves likely remained simple and familiar. A typical evening meal in a Roman barracks might involve bread made from recently milled grain, a stew of beans or lentils, perhaps some pieces of salted pork, and a little oil or herbs for flavor. Soldiers would sit together in their small living group, sharing the work of cooking and eating. In that moment, the vast machinery of the Roman Empire faded into the background. The roads, taxes, warehouses, and transport systems all existed to make that small scene possible. 8 soldiers gathered around a meal might not have thought about the imperial systems behind their food, but those systems were quietly working all the same. The Roman army is often remembered for its battles, its armor, and its disciplined formations. But beneath all of that was something more ordinary and more constant. Every soldier needed to eat, every day wherever the empire sent him. The ability to provide that food reliably was one of the hidden strengths of Roman power. And through the fragments left behind, broken bones, charred seeds, worn grinding stones, and scraps of writing, we can still see the traces of those meals, quietly sustaining the soldiers who guarded the frontiers of one of history's greatest empires. Over time, the Roman military diet also reflected the gradual transformation of the Roman army itself. In the early centuries of the Republic, Roman soldiers were often citizen farmers who served in campaigns and then returned to their land. Their diet during military service was not dramatically different from what they ate at home. Grain, olives, vegetables, and occasional meat were already part of the everyday agricultural life of Italy. Military food, therefore, reflected familiar rural habits. But as Rome expanded and the army evolved into a long-term professional force, soldiers began spending years, sometimes decades, stationed far from their original homes. A soldier from Italy might spend most of his career on the Rhine frontier, in the deserts of Syria, or along the distant walls of Britain. In these environments, the Roman military diet slowly absorbed regional influences, creating a blend of traditions drawn from across the empire. This process can be seen clearly in the archaeological record. At forts along the northern frontiers, for example, historians have found evidence of foods that were common in local cultures but less typical in early Roman Italy. Barley and oats appear more frequently in some northern regions, reflecting the agricultural patterns of colder climates, where wheat was sometimes harder to grow. Soldiers stationed in these areas likely consumed whatever grains were most available through local production. Similarly, the presence of local livestock shaped meat consumption. In areas where cattle were abundant, beef might appear more often in the diet. In regions with strong traditions of pig farming, pork became the dominant meat. Sheep and goats, which adapted well to rugged landscapes, provided both meat and dairy products in many frontier provinces. The Roman army's ability to incorporate these local food sources allowed it to maintain long-term garrisons in areas far from the Mediterranean heartland. Fish also became an important supplement in certain locations. In coastal regions, riverside settlements, or areas near lakes, soldiers could obtain fresh fish either through fishing or through local markets. Fish sauce and other preserved fish products traveled widely through Roman trade networks, and amphorae used to transport these products have been discovered at numerous military sites. Even in distant provinces, Roman soldiers could occasionally enjoy flavors that connected them to broader Mediterranean food traditions. Another subtle but important element of the Roman soldier's diet involved herbs and seasonings. Roman cooking did not rely on heavy sauces or complex spices in the way some later cuisines would, but herbs still played a role in adding flavor to otherwise simple meals. Archaeological evidence suggests the presence of herbs such as coriander, dill, and fennel at some military settlements. These herbs may have been grown locally in small garden plots near forts, a practice that would have helped supplement the diet with fresh ingredients. In fact, gardens were likely a quiet but valuable part of life around many Roman forts. Small cultivated areas could produce vegetables, herbs, and perhaps fruit trees that added variety to soldiers' meals. These gardens also reflect the semi-permanent nature of many Roman military installations. Some forts remained occupied for decades or even centuries, allowing soldiers and local communities to develop stable food production systems nearby. The relationship between soldiers and agriculture went beyond simple consumption. In some circumstances, soldiers themselves participated in farming activities. Roman military units often undertook construction and infrastructure projects, but they could also assist in developing farmland near frontier zones. Clearing land, building irrigation systems, or maintaining rural roads could all contribute indirectly to the food supply of the region. This blending of military and agricultural activity highlights an important feature of Roman imperial strategy. The army was not only a fighting force, it was also a stabilizing presence that helped organize frontier landscapes. By encouraging agriculture and trade near military settlements, the Roman state ensured that soldiers could be supplied locally rather than relying entirely on long-distance transport. Food preparation inside the fort also reveals how Roman soldiers balanced routine with adaptability. While grain remained the central ration, the ways it could be prepared were flexible. Bread might be baked in ovens during stable garrison life, but on campaign soldiers might rely more on simple porridge or flatbreads cooked quickly over open fires. Legumes could be boiled into stews that stretched limited ingredients across multiple servings. Cooking vessels discovered at military sites, large pots, smaller bowls, ladles, and grinding stones, show that these meals were prepared with practical tools designed for repeated use. Roman pottery was sturdy and functional, suitable for heating over fires and easy to replace when broken. These everyday objects rarely received the attention given to weapons or armor, yet they were just as essential to the daily functioning of the army. Another feature of Roman military food culture was its connection to routine schedules. Roman soldiers followed highly structured daily timetables that included guard shifts, training exercises, construction work, and maintenance duties. Meals fit into this rhythm. Eating times provided short periods of rest within a disciplined schedule. For men living far from their original homes, these shared meals also helped maintain a sense of community. In the evenings, after the day's work was complete, soldiers gathered in their small contubernum groups to prepare and eat food together. Fires flickered in the barracks areas, cooking pots simmered, and grain was ground for the next day's bread. Conversations likely ranged from ordinary complaints about work to stories from distant provinces. In these moments, the army functioned not only as a military machine but also as a network of small social groups bound together by shared routines. When historians step back and examine the Roman army as a whole, it becomes clear that food was not merely a background detail. It was a central component of how the military operated. Without reliable nutrition, soldiers could not maintain the physical endurance required for long marches and construction labor. Without organized supply systems, distant garrisons could not survive harsh winters or extended campaigns. The Roman Empire lasted for centuries in part because it mastered these practical challenges. The same administrative mindset that built roads, aqueducts, and legal systems also ensured that armies were consistently supplied with the basic necessities of life. Food, humble though it may seem, was one of the pillars that supported Roman power. So when we imagine the Roman soldier once more, standing watch on a wooden tower along a misty frontier or marching along a stone road through unfamiliar lands, we should also remember the quieter moments that sustained him. The grinding of grain beneath a small hand mill, the smell of bread baking in a military oven, the sharing of a simple meal among companions after a day of hard labor. These ordinary scenes rarely appear in heroic stories of conquest. Yet without them, the legions that shaped Roman history could never have endured. As the Roman Empire matured, the organization behind military food supply became even more sophisticated. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Rome controlled vast agricultural regions capable of producing enormous quantities of grain and livestock. These provinces were not simply distant territories. They were carefully integrated parts of a system designed to support both civilian populations and the army. One of the most famous grain-producing regions was Egypt. After Rome annexed Egypt in 30 BCE, its fertile Nile Valley became one of the empire's most important agricultural centers. Grain harvested there was transported north across the Mediterranean, helping feed major cities such as Rome itself. While much of Egypt's grain supported the civilian population, the existence of such large-scale production also strengthened the empire's overall ability to sustain its military forces. North Africa played a similar role. Regions in modern Tunisia and Libya produced large harvests of wheat that were shipped through Roman trade networks. From ports along the Mediterranean coast, grain could travel by ship to different parts of the empire, including military supply depots. Sea transport was far more efficient than moving goods by land, and Roman planners relied heavily on maritime routes whenever possible. Yet, even with these large-scale supply networks, the Roman army still preferred to obtain food locally whenever conditions allowed it. Supplying soldiers from nearby farms and markets reduced the strain on long-distance transportation and made garrisons more sustainable over time. This approach also encouraged economic growth in frontier provinces. Farmers, traders, and craftsmen living near military installations could benefit from the steady demand created by thousands of soldiers stationed in the area. Over the decades, this relationship between the army and local communities often transformed frontier regions. A newly established fort might begin as a purely military installation, but gradually markets, workshops, and settlements would develop nearby. Soldiers purchased food, clothing, tools, and other goods from these communities, while local producers relied on the army as a stable customer. Food supply was therefore not only a military concern but also a driver of regional economic development. Inside the forts themselves, food distribution followed organized procedures. Rations were typically measured and issued in controlled amounts. Grain allotments were often calculated per soldier, ensuring that each man received enough to sustain himself while avoiding unnecessary waste. Officers and quartermasters supervised these distributions, keeping records that helped maintain accountability within the system. Roman military administration was known for its attention to record-keeping. Written accounts, supply lists, and logistical reports helped commanders track the movement of provisions across long distances. While many of these documents have been lost over time, surviving fragments reveal the complexity of the system. Food did not simply arrive at a fort by chance. It was planned, counted, and carefully managed. The tools used to process food also tell us much about daily life inside Roman barracks. Grinding stones, known as querns, were essential for turning grain into flour. These stones required physical effort to operate, meaning that soldiers themselves had to contribute time and labor to preparing their meals. The repetitive motion of grinding grain must have been a familiar part of daily routine, particularly in the early evening as soldiers prepared food after finishing their assigned duties. Large cooking pots, often made of durable ceramic, were used to prepare stews and grain dishes that could feed several men at once. These pots could sit directly over open flames, allowing simple meals to be prepared with limited equipment. Archaeological finds show that Roman military pottery was designed with practicality in mind: thick walls to withstand heat, sturdy handles for lifting, and shapes that made storage efficient in cramped living spaces. Even the layout of Roman barracks reflects the importance of shared meals. Each contubernium had a designated living area that functioned as both sleeping quarters and a small domestic space. Within this space, soldiers stored their belongings, including cooking tools and food supplies. Meals prepared in these small groups helped strengthen the sense of unity among soldiers who depended on one another in battle. There were also moments when the ordinary diet of the Roman soldier could briefly become more generous. Religious festivals, military victories, or imperial celebrations sometimes included special distributions of food. Extra meat, wine, or bread might be issued to mark the occasion. These moments served not only as rewards but also as reminders of the soldier's connection to the broader Roman state. In some cases, emperors themselves ordered large public distributions of food to the army. Such gestures reinforced loyalty and demonstrated imperial generosity. Soldiers who felt recognized and rewarded were more likely to remain disciplined and committed to their duties. Food, once again, served both practical and symbolic purposes within the military structure. Another factor shaping Roman military diet was climate. Soldiers stationed in desert regions faced different challenges from those serving in colder northern provinces. In hot environments, preserving food required careful management to prevent spoilage. Water supplies became especially important, and commanders had to plan routes that ensured access to wells or rivers. In colder climates, on the other hand, soldiers needed higher calorie intake to maintain energy during harsh winters. Roman supply systems adapted to these environmental differences. In Northern Europe, for example, archaeologists have found evidence that soldiers consumed larger amounts of meat and animal fat, which provided more concentrated energy during cold conditions. In Mediterranean regions, meals might rely more heavily on olive oil, vegetables, and lighter grain dishes suited to warmer weather. Despite these regional variations, the core structure of the Roman soldier's diet remained remarkably stable across centuries. Grain remained the essential ration. Legumes added protein and variety. Meat appeared when available, often preserved with salt. Cheese and oil supplemented meals, while diluted wine or vinegar water provided hydration. This consistency reflects one of the defining strengths of Roman military organization. The army was built on systems that could function across vast distances and diverse landscapes. By relying on foods that were widely available, easy to store, and simple to prepare, the Roman military ensured that its soldiers could be sustained almost anywhere the empire extended. And when historians consider the remarkable endurance of the Roman army, its ability to campaign year after year, generation after generation, it becomes clear that these ordinary meals played a quiet but essential role. Empires are often remembered for their battles and leaders, yet they survive on something far more basic. They survive on the steady rhythm of daily life. For the Roman soldier, that rhythm included the familiar routine of grinding grain, baking bread, sharing simple stews, and drinking watered wine at the end of a long day's work. Those small, repeated actions sustained the men who guarded Rome's borders and carried its authority across continents. There were also times when the diet of Roman soldiers changed under the pressures of war. Campaigning placed enormous strain on supply systems, and when armies moved deep into hostile or unfamiliar territory, regular deliveries of grain and preserved food could become uncertain. In these situations, Roman soldiers had to rely more heavily on improvisation and local resources. Foraging was one of the most common solutions. Small groups of soldiers were sometimes sent into surrounding areas to gather food, collect firewood, or obtain livestock from nearby farms. This process was usually organized carefully by commanders because it carried risks. Soldiers moving away from the main army could be vulnerable to ambush, especially in hostile regions. As a result, foraging parties were often guarded and sent out in controlled numbers rather than allowing soldiers to scatter across the countryside. Another method involved requisitioning supplies from local populations. In territories already under Roman control, provincial administrators might be responsible for providing food to passing armies. Local communities could be required to deliver grain, animals, or other provisions as part of their obligations to the empire. While this system helped sustain Roman military campaigns, it could also place heavy burdens on rural populations, especially during long wars. Sometimes the Roman army also transported livestock alongside its marching columns. Herds of animals, cattle, sheep, or goats, could travel with the army and be slaughtered gradually to provide fresh meat. This approach reduced reliance on uncertain supply lines, though it also required additional effort to manage and protect the animals during long marches. When regular food sources became scarce, soldiers had to stretch their supplies as efficiently as possible. Grain porridge could be diluted with additional water to feed larger groups. Legumes could be mixed with smaller amounts of meat to create stews that provided flavor and nutrition without exhausting valuable resources too quickly. These techniques allowed armies to survive difficult stretches of campaigning even when conditions were less than ideal. The Roman military diet also reveals something about health and endurance in the ancient world. Although Roman soldiers did not understand nutrition in modern scientific terms, their typical diet contained many elements that supported physical strength. Grain provided carbohydrates for energy, legumes supplied plant-based protein, and meat or cheese contributed additional fats and nutrients. Olive oil added calories and helped maintain energy levels during long periods of labor. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains from Roman military cemeteries suggest that many soldiers were physically strong and well-nourished compared to some civilian populations of the same era. The structured diet of the army, combined with regular physical activity and organized living conditions, may have contributed to relatively good health among long-serving soldiers. Roman medical writers also understood that diet played a role in maintaining the strength of the body. Military doctors, known as medici, sometimes advised commanders on issues related to food and health. Although ancient medicine was limited compared to modern knowledge, Roman physicians recognized that proper nourishment could help prevent weakness and illness. Ensuring that soldiers received adequate food was therefore not only a logistical concern but also a matter of maintaining military readiness. In certain cases, soldiers recovering from wounds or illness might receive modified diets designed to help them regain strength. Broths, softer grain preparations, or lighter foods could be recommended during recovery. While these adjustments were probably simple by modern standards, they reflect an early understanding that diet and healing were closely connected. Food could also carry emotional significance for soldiers serving far from home. Many Roman troops were stationed thousands of miles from the regions where they had grown up. A soldier from Italy stationed in Britain or Syria might spend decades in a landscape very different from the one he knew as a young man. Familiar foods, wine from a particular region, olive oil from Mediterranean groves, or traditional bread recipes, could provide a sense of cultural continuity even in distant provinces. Trade networks helped maintain these connections. Amphorae carrying wine, oil, and other Mediterranean products have been discovered in forts across northern Europe. These containers show that Roman supply systems continued to move familiar foods across enormous distances, linking frontier soldiers to the cultural heartlands of the empire. At the same time, soldiers gradually adopted elements of local food culture as they spent years living among provincial communities. This blending of traditions created unique culinary environments in frontier regions. A Roman soldier in Britain might eat Mediterranean-style bread with olive oil, while also drinking locally brewed beer or eating meats prepared according to regional customs. Over time, the Roman army became a powerful channel for cultural exchange, and food played a quiet role in that process. Soldiers carried their dietary habits with them wherever they served, while also adapting to new ingredients and cooking techniques encountered along the way. Markets near military forts became places where these different traditions met and blended. The result was a military food culture that was both Roman and regional at the same time. The core elements, grain rations, legumes, preserved meats, oil, and diluted wine, remained consistent across the empire. Yet the details surrounding those core foods varied depending on geography, climate, and local agriculture. This balance between standardization and flexibility was one of the great strengths of the Roman military system. By relying on simple, widely available foods, the army ensured that its basic nutritional needs could be met almost anywhere. At the same time, the willingness to incorporate local resources allowed Roman forces to operate effectively in environments that were very different from the Mediterranean landscapes where Roman power first emerged. When we step back and consider the full picture, the diet of the Roman soldier becomes more than a curiosity about ancient meals. It becomes a window into the larger systems that sustained the Roman Empire. Agriculture, trade, administration, engineering, and military discipline all intersected in the simple act of feeding soldiers. Every sack of grain delivered to a fort represented the labor of farmers, the organization of transport networks, and the oversight of military administrators. Every meal prepared in a barracks room reflected the cooperation of soldiers working together within the structured routines of army life. In this way, the food of the Roman army tells a story that is both ordinary and profound. It reminds us that the power of Rome did not rest solely on its legions marching into battle. It also rested on the quiet, daily work that kept those legions fed, organized, and ready to serve wherever the empire required them. And for the men who lived that life, the soldiers standing watch on distant frontiers or marching along the long stone roads of the empire, each simple meal marked the continuation of another demanding day in the service of Rome. As the centuries passed, the Roman army itself slowly changed, and those changes also influenced what soldiers ate and how food was organized within military life. During the early Republic, Roman soldiers had been temporary citizen fighters. Campaigns were usually seasonal, and men often returned to their farms after the fighting ended. Their military diet, therefore, remained closely tied to the agricultural habits of rural Italy. But by the late Republic and into the imperial period, the Roman army became a permanent professional institution. Soldiers served for long terms, often 20 years or more, and were stationed across distant frontiers. This transformation meant that the army had to maintain a far more stable and permanent food system than earlier Roman forces had required. Feeding a professional army year after year demanded careful organization, dependable agriculture, and efficient transportation networks. One of the ways the Romans achieved this stability was by standardizing certain rations. Grain remained the central element because it could be stored, measured, and distributed in predictable quantities. A soldier's ration of grain could be calculated precisely, making it easier for military administrators to plan supply levels for entire legions. Even when other foods varied depending on location, grain ensured that soldiers always had access to a dependable source of calories. This system also allowed Roman armies to remain flexible. Because grain could be transported in bulk and stored for long periods, commanders could build reserves in fortified depots before beginning major campaigns. These supply depots, sometimes located along key roads or near rivers, acted as logistical anchors that supported military operations in surrounding regions. In addition to official supply systems, soldiers sometimes supplemented their food through personal initiative. Roman soldiers received pay, and although much of it was deducted for equipment and provisions, they could still use some of their income to purchase additional food. Markets near forts often offered a wide range of goods brought by traders from surrounding areas. Soldiers who wished to improve their meals could buy extra meat, vegetables, fruit, or locally produced foods. Evidence for this can be seen in the remains of imported goods discovered at military sites. Amphorae that once contained wine, olive oil, or fish products have been found even in distant frontier forts. These containers show that trade routes connected Roman soldiers to the wider economic world of the empire. Even on the edge of Roman territory, it was possible to encounter goods that had traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles. At the same time, soldiers adapted to the agricultural environment around them. In Northern Europe, for example, local grains such as barley and oats were sometimes used alongside wheat. These crops were better suited to colder climates and shorter growing seasons. By incorporating local harvests into military supply systems, the Roman army reduced its dependence on long-distance shipments from Mediterranean regions. The adaptability of Roman military diet can also be seen in the use of preserved foods. Preservation was essential in a world without refrigeration. Salting, drying, and smoking allowed meat and fish to remain edible for long periods. Cheese, which could last longer than fresh milk, was another practical addition to the soldier's diet. Dried fruits such as figs or raisins provided sweetness and energy while remaining easy to transport. These preserved foods were especially valuable during winter months or extended campaigns. When fresh vegetables and fruits were scarce, preserved supplies helped maintain nutritional balance. Roman administrators therefore had to plan not only for immediate needs but also for seasonal changes that affected food availability. Another element of Roman military life connected to food was the routine of cooking itself. Unlike some later armies that relied heavily on centralized kitchens, Roman soldiers frequently prepared their own meals within their small living groups. This responsibility reinforced the idea that soldiers were expected to manage practical tasks alongside their military duties. Cooking together strengthened bonds within the contubernium, the small unit of 8 soldiers who shared a barracks room. Each group worked together to grind grain, prepare ingredients, and cook meals over small fires. These shared responsibilities encouraged cooperation and mutual reliance, qualities that were essential during combat situations. The rhythm of preparing food also brought moments of calm into the otherwise structured life of the army. After long hours of training, construction work, or patrol duty, the act of cooking allowed soldiers to slow down and reconnect with familiar routines. The sound of grinding stones, the crackle of firewood, and the smell of bread or stew must have filled the air inside Roman forts every evening. For soldiers stationed far from home, these meals carried emotional meaning as well. Food has always been closely connected to memory and identity, and Roman soldiers were no exception. A familiar recipe, a particular kind of bread, or a cup of wine from a homeland region could remind a soldier of the place where he had grown up. Because Roman legions were often recruited from many different provinces, military communities became culturally diverse environments. Soldiers from Italy, Gaul, Spain, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean might serve side by side. Their food traditions gradually blended, creating shared habits that reflected both Roman culture and regional influences. Over time, this blending contributed to the broader cultural integration of the empire. Military service exposed soldiers to new foods, cooking styles, and agricultural practices. When veterans eventually retired and settled in different provinces, they often carried those habits with them, spreading culinary influences across regions that had once been very different. In this quiet way, food helped shape the cultural landscape of the Roman world. The army, often remembered for its discipline and power, also functioned as a channel through which everyday traditions moved across the empire. When we consider the long history of Roman military success, it becomes clear that such ordinary details mattered. Feeding tens of thousands of soldiers across distant territories required not only strength but also organization, patience, and cooperation between soldiers and civilians alike. And at the center of that vast system was a simple, daily moment repeated in forts, camps, and frontier settlements throughout the empire. Soldiers gathering after a day's work, preparing a modest meal, and sharing it among companions who relied on one another for survival. It may not sound like the dramatic image often associated with Roman legions. Yet without those quiet meals, without the bread, the grain, the stews, and the simple discipline of daily nourishment, the armies of Rome could never have marched as far, endured as long, or shaped history in the way they did. By the later centuries of the Roman Empire, the systems that supported the army's food supply had become deeply embedded within imperial administration. Feeding soldiers was no longer simply a matter of gathering grain and livestock. It had evolved into a complex logistical network that connected farmers, merchants, transport workers, provincial officials, and military commanders across enormous distances. In many provinces, agricultural production was partially organized with military needs in mind. Fields produced not only food for local populations but also surplus grain that could be directed toward garrisons and frontier armies. This surplus was often collected through taxation. Instead of paying taxes entirely in coin, rural communities sometimes delivered grain, animals, or other agricultural products to state officials who then arranged transport to military supply centers. These supply centers served as storage and redistribution hubs. Grain arriving from surrounding regions could be collected in large warehouses before being forwarded to forts, camps, or frontier outposts where soldiers were stationed. Some of these storage facilities were enormous by ancient standards. Thick walls, raised floors, and carefully planned ventilation systems protected the food from moisture and pests. Roman engineers understood that losing large quantities of stored grain could endanger entire military operations. Transportation remained one of the greatest challenges in maintaining this supply network. Moving heavy goods across long distances required reliable infrastructure. Roman roads played a critical role in this process. Built with remarkable durability and precision, these roads allowed wagons, pack animals, and marching columns to travel more efficiently than in many other ancient societies. Rivers also functioned as vital supply routes. Where possible, grain and other provisions were transported by boat, since water transport was far more efficient than moving heavy cargo overland. Barges traveling along rivers such as the Rhine, Danube, and Nile carried supplies that supported nearby military installations. Ports and river landings near forts became busy points of exchange where goods moved from ships onto wagons or pack animals for final delivery. Yet even the most organized supply network could not eliminate all difficulties. Weather, political unrest, poor harvests, or damaged infrastructure could disrupt deliveries. When shortages occurred, commanders sometimes had to ration supplies carefully to ensure that food lasted until new shipments arrived. These moments reminded the Roman army of a fundamental truth. Even the most disciplined military force remained vulnerable without reliable food. To reduce the risk of shortages, Roman planners often maintained reserves whenever possible. Forts might store extra grain in anticipation of winter or potential conflict. During major campaigns, commanders could establish temporary depots along the planned route of advance, ensuring that supplies would be available as the army moved forward. These logistical preparations were as important to success as any battlefield strategy. The organization of food distribution inside the army also reflected the structured nature of Roman military life. Quartermasters and administrative officers monitored rations and supervised deliveries. Their work rarely appeared in heroic histories, yet it formed the backbone of military stability. Without accurate records and careful management, even the largest army could quickly descend into confusion. For the ordinary soldier, however, these vast systems remained largely invisible. What he experienced was the daily routine of receiving rations, preparing food with his contubernum, and eating simple meals after hours of work or training. The scale of the empire's logistical machinery faded into the background of everyday life. Still, small details within that daily routine hinted at the larger system behind it. The sack of grain issued at the start of a week might have been harvested in fields many miles away. The olive oil poured over a meal might have traveled across the Mediterranean in a clay amphora. The salted meat cooked in a barracks pot might have come from livestock raised in nearby villages. Each ingredient carried a story of transport, trade, and organization. The Roman army's ability to maintain the steady flow of food across centuries is one reason historians continue to study its logistical systems with admiration. Empires often rise through conquest, but they endure through administration. Feeding thousands of soldiers year after year required patience, planning, and cooperation between many different parts of Roman society. And through all of this complexity, the meal itself remained strikingly simple. After the day's work was done, soldiers returned to their barracks. Fires were lit, grain was ground, and food was prepared in shared pots. Conversation filled the small rooms as men who had marched together, built defenses together, and stood watch together now shared the most ordinary act of human life. A piece of bread, a bowl of grain or beans, perhaps some meat or cheese, a drink of watered wine or vinegar. Nothing extravagant, nothing elaborate, yet these quiet meals sustained the men who guarded the frontiers of Rome. In the steady rhythm of eating, resting, and returning to duty the next morning, the strength of the Roman army was renewed day after day. And so the story of what Roman soldiers ate turns out to be more than a curiosity about ancient food. It reveals how an empire managed the practical realities of sustaining power across vast distances. Behind every march, every fort, and every victory stood something simple but essential: a reliable meal shared among soldiers who depended on it to continue their long service to Rome. By the time the Roman Empire reached its height, the daily diet of soldiers had become part of a broader culture of military routine that shaped almost every hour of their lives. Roman soldiers did not simply eat when they felt hungry. Meals were tied to the strict rhythms of army schedules, training exercises, guard rotations, construction work, inspections, and patrols. Food became one more element in a carefully organized day designed to maintain discipline and efficiency. A typical day inside a Roman fort likely began early. Soldiers woke before sunrise to prepare for the day's duties. In the morning, food might be simple and quick, perhaps bread from the previous day's baking, accompanied by diluted wine or vinegar water. These early meals were not elaborate. They were meant to provide enough energy for the first hours of labor or training. Much of the soldier's day involved physically demanding work. Contrary to the popular image of soldiers constantly preparing for battle, Roman troops spent long stretches of time performing construction and maintenance tasks. They built roads, repaired fortifications, dug defensive ditches, and constructed bridges or watchtowers. Such labor required endurance, and the steady intake of grain-based foods provided the energy needed to sustain it. Midday meals during working hours were often modest. Bread, cheese, olives when available, or preserved meats could be eaten quickly before soldiers returned to their duties. Because Roman military life emphasized efficiency, meals during active parts of the day were usually practical rather than leisurely. The evening meal, however, was often the most substantial part of the day. After the completion of duties, soldiers returned to their barracks where the contubernium, the group of 8 men who lived together, prepared food collectively. Fires were lit in small hearths or cooking areas, and the process of grinding grain and preparing stews or porridge began. This routine was not merely about nutrition. The shared work of preparing food strengthened the bonds between soldiers. Each member of the group contributed in some way, one grinding grain, another tending the fire, another preparing ingredients. In an army that relied heavily on teamwork during battle, these daily habits helped build trust and familiarity among the men. Archaeological evidence shows that Roman forts were carefully organized to support these routines. Barracks buildings contained paired rooms, with one area used for sleeping and another for storage and cooking activities. Cooking vessels, storage jars, and grinding stones discovered in these spaces demonstrate how integrated food preparation was within soldiers' living quarters. The smell of cooking food must have been a familiar part of the evening atmosphere inside Roman forts. The sound of grinding stones, the crackling of fires, and the quiet conversation of soldiers relaxing after a long day would have filled the barracks. In many ways, these moments resembled the ordinary domestic life of households across the Roman world, even though the setting was a military installation. Another important feature of Roman military diet was the regular distribution of rations. Commanders understood that fairness in food allocation was crucial for maintaining morale. If soldiers believed rations were being distributed unfairly, resentment could quickly spread through a unit. Roman military discipline therefore extended to the careful supervision of supplies, ensuring that each soldier received his proper share. In addition to basic rations, soldiers sometimes received extra food during special occasions. Religious festivals honoring Roman gods, imperial anniversaries, or military victories could all bring temporary improvements to the daily diet. These events might include additional meat, better wine, or larger portions of bread. Such moments of abundance were significant not only because they improved the meal but because they reinforced the connection between soldiers and the wider Roman state. Distributions ordered by emperors or commanders reminded soldiers that their service was recognized and valued. Food, in this sense, became a symbol of imperial generosity and unity. Despite these occasional celebrations, however, the Roman soldiers' everyday diet remained remarkably consistent across centuries. The core foods, grain, legumes, preserved meat, cheese, olive oil, and diluted wine, formed a reliable nutritional foundation that could be reproduced across many regions of the empire. This consistency reveals one of the defining characteristics of Roman administration: the ability to standardize essential systems while still adapting to local conditions. The Roman army operated across deserts, forests, mountains, and coastal regions, yet its basic dietary structure remained recognizable wherever soldiers were stationed. When historians examine these patterns, they often note how closely Roman military success was tied to logistical stability. Armies require more than weapons and training. They require dependable food supplies that can support thousands of individuals over long periods. The Roman Empire managed to provide that support with a level of organization rarely matched in the ancient world. For the soldier standing guard on a remote frontier tower or marching along a distant road, these vast systems might not have been visible. What he experienced was something much simpler: the familiar routine of preparing food with his companions, eating a modest meal, and resting before the next day's duties began. And yet within that ordinary moment, 8 soldiers sharing bread and stew inside a barracks room, the strength of the Roman military system quietly revealed itself. Because every meal represented the successful cooperation of farmers, traders, transport workers, administrators, and soldiers themselves. Every meal meant that the system was still functioning. Every meal allowed the legion to wake the next morning ready to march, build, guard, or fight. In that quiet, repetitive rhythm of daily nourishment, the Roman Empire sustained one of the most formidable armies in history, an army that depended not only on courage and discipline, but on the simple certainty that food would be there when the day's work was done. In many ways, the Roman army's approach to food reflects a deeper principle that shaped the entire empire: the belief that stability comes from organization. Rome did not rely on chance when feeding its soldiers. It relied on systems, predictable routines that turned agriculture, transport, storage, and cooking into parts of a single coordinated structure. And nowhere was this structure more visible than in the daily life of a Roman fort. When a new fort was constructed, Roman engineers planned far more than just defensive walls and watchtowers. They also designed the internal layout to support the practical needs of the soldiers who would live there. Streets were laid out in orderly grids. Barracks were arranged in rows. Storage buildings, workshops, and granaries were positioned carefully so that supplies could be protected and distributed efficiently. Granaries in particular were among the most important buildings inside a Roman fort. These structures were designed to preserve grain for long periods, sometimes storing enough food to support hundreds or even thousands of soldiers. The floors were often raised above the ground on stone supports, allowing air to circulate underneath and reducing moisture that might spoil the grain. Thick walls protected the interior from temperature changes, while narrow openings allowed ventilation without exposing the stores to pests or heavy rain. Inside these granaries, sacks or containers of grain were stacked in orderly rows. Each delivery was recorded and monitored. If a shipment arrived from nearby farms or provincial tax collections, officials ensured that it was measured and stored properly. The Roman army's administrative culture meant that even basic food supplies were subject to careful oversight. But grain alone was only the beginning. Once it left the granary, the real work began: the daily transformation of raw ingredients into meals. Roman soldiers were expected to participate directly in this process. Unlike some later armies with centralized kitchens, the Roman military system encouraged smaller groups of soldiers to manage their own cooking. The contubernium, The 8-man unit sharing a barracks room was responsible for preparing its own meals. This system created a rhythm of cooperation. One soldier might grind grain using a hand mill, slowly turning the heavy stone until flour formed beneath it. Another soldier might prepare a pot for cooking, adding water and ingredients for a simple stew. Others gathered firewood or tended the small hearth where the food would be cooked. Grinding grain by hand was not easy work. The rotary quern, the common Roman hand mill, required steady physical effort. The upper stone had to be rotated repeatedly while grain was fed into the center. Over time, the grain was crushed into coarse flour that could be used for bread or porridge. For soldiers already tired from the day's duties, this task added another layer of labor to the evening routine. Yet the Romans viewed such work as part of military discipline. Preparing food was not considered a distraction from soldiering. It was part of the structure that kept soldiers self-sufficient. The ability to cook and manage provisions meant that soldiers could operate far from major supply centers when necessary. Bread was one of the most common results of this labor. In permanent forts, ovens allowed soldiers to bake loaves regularly. These ovens, often dome-shaped and built from brick or stone, could produce bread for many men at once. Archaeological remains of such ovens have been discovered in numerous Roman forts across Europe and the Middle East. The bread itself would have been dense and filling rather than soft and refined. Roman flour often contained bran and other coarse elements, producing a heavier texture than modern white bread. But this bread had an important advantage. It was nutritious and provided lasting energy. Alongside bread, soldiers frequently prepared porridges or grain stews. These meals required fewer ingredients and less time than baking. Grain could be boiled in water, sometimes mixed with beans or lentils to add protein and flavor. Olive oil or animal fat might be added when available, making the meal richer and more satisfying. Cooking pots discovered at military sites reveal how common these stews likely were. The pots were sturdy and designed for repeated heating over open fires. Some were large enough to prepare food for several men at once, reinforcing the communal nature of meals within the contubernium. Despite the simplicity of these meals, Roman soldiers did not necessarily view them as unpleasant. For people living in the ancient world, such foods were familiar and practical. Grain-based diets were common across many cultures, and Roman soldiers would have grown up eating similar meals long before joining the army. Still, there were moments when food provided more than basic nourishment. After a long march, a successful construction project, or the completion of a difficult assignment, the evening meal could become a moment of relaxation and conversation. Soldiers gathered around the hearth, shared stories from their home provinces, discussed rumors from other parts of the empire, and enjoyed a brief pause from the rigid structure of military life. Wine sometimes appeared during these moments, usually diluted with water according to Roman custom. Wine had a strong cultural presence in Roman society and remained a familiar part of life even on distant frontiers. Amphorae carrying wine from Mediterranean regions have been found in forts across northern Europe, demonstrating the reach of Roman trade networks. Yet even here, moderation was expected. Excessive drinking was discouraged in military settings, as it could undermine discipline. Roman commanders believed that a soldier should remain alert and ready for duty at all times. Wine, therefore, was consumed as part of daily life but rarely allowed to disrupt the structured rhythm of the army. As night settled over the fort and the fires burned lower, soldiers finished their meals and prepared for rest. Guard shifts were assigned, equipment was checked, and the camp gradually grew quieter. The same soldiers who had spent the day marching, building, or training now slept in close quarters beside the companions with whom they had shared their food. Then, before sunrise, the routine would begin again. Grain would be issued from the stores. Bread or porridge would be prepared. Duties would resume, and through this steady, almost unremarkable cycle of work and nourishment, the Roman army maintained the strength that allowed it to guard the borders of one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever known. There is also an important human dimension to the Roman soldier's diet that often disappears behind discussions of logistics and supply systems. Food was not only fuel for the body. It was also one of the few daily experiences that connected soldiers to ordinary life beyond the strict discipline of the army. In a world defined by orders, drills, and hierarchy, the act of preparing and sharing a meal created a small space where soldiers could experience familiarity and companionship. Most Roman soldiers lived in close quarters for many years. A man might spend 2 decades with the same unit, often serving alongside the same small group within his contubernium. These 8 men shared sleeping space, storage areas, duties, and meals. Over time, this group became something like a surrogate household. They depended on each other not only in battle but in the quiet routines of everyday life. The preparation of food reinforced these bonds. When soldiers gathered in the evening to grind grain, cook stew, and bake bread, they were participating in a rhythm that resembled the domestic routines of families throughout the Roman world. The tools might have been simple hand mills, clay pots, wooden ladles, but the meaning of the activity was familiar. Cooking and eating together helped create stability in an environment where much of life was controlled by military schedules. This sense of shared routine may have been particularly important for soldiers serving far from their home provinces. The Roman army recruited men from many different regions of the empire. A single unit might include soldiers from Italy, Gaul, the Balkans, Spain, or the Eastern Mediterranean. When these men arrived at distant frontiers, they often encountered unfamiliar landscapes and climates. Food sometimes provided a bridge between these different cultural backgrounds. Soldiers brought their own culinary habits with them when they joined the army. Over time, these habits blended with the foods available in the regions where they were stationed. The result was a kind of shared military food culture that reflected both Roman traditions and local influences. For example, a soldier originally from Italy might have grown up eating wheat bread, olive oil, and wine. When stationed in northern provinces like Britain or along the Rhine, he might encounter local grains such as barley or oats, or drink locally produced beer. These new foods gradually became part of daily life for many soldiers, even if they remained different from the tastes of home. Archaeological discoveries illustrate this mixture clearly. In forts across northern Europe, researchers have found Mediterranean imports, olive oil amphorae, wine containers, and evidence of dried fruits, alongside local products such as native grains and regional meats. This combination shows that Roman soldiers lived at the intersection of 2 worlds: the imperial culture they represented and the provincial environments where they served. Markets that developed near Roman forts helped facilitate this exchange. Traders traveled to these settlements bringing goods from nearby farms or distant provinces. Soldiers could purchase fresh vegetables, fruit, meat, or other foods if they had the means. These markets became lively spaces where soldiers and civilians interacted, exchanging not only goods but also customs and knowledge. Over time, these interactions contributed to the cultural integration of the empire. Soldiers who spent years stationed in a particular province often developed familiarity with local foods and traditions. When they eventually retired from service, many veterans settled in the provinces where they had served. In doing so, they carried elements of Roman military culture into local communities while also preserving the regional influences they had adopted. Food, therefore, played a subtle role in the spread of Roman culture. Military settlements became places where culinary habits blended and traveled across regions. A recipe learned in one province might appear later in another as soldiers moved through the empire during their careers. At the same time, the Roman army maintained certain shared habits that connected soldiers to a broader identity. The reliance on grain rations, the practice of cooking within the contubernium, and the daily rhythm of preparing meals together were experiences common to soldiers serving from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Germania. These routines created a sense of continuity across enormous distances. A soldier transferred from one frontier to another would still recognize the basic structure of military life: the granaries storing grain, the hand mills grinding flour, the evening fires where food was prepared after the day's work. For Roman commanders, this consistency was valuable. Shared habits reinforced discipline and unity within the army. When soldiers followed familiar routines, they were better able to adapt to new environments without losing their sense of belonging to the larger military system. Of course, the Roman soldier's diet was not always comfortable. Campaigns could bring shortages, poor weather could damage crops, and long marches could limit access to fresh food. During difficult periods, Soldiers sometimes had to rely heavily on preserved rations or stretch their supplies carefully. Yet, even during these hardships, the structure of the Roman military system helped prevent complete breakdown. Commanders monitored supplies, organized foraging when necessary, and attempted to maintain at least the basic grain ration that formed the foundation of the soldier's diet. This resilience was one reason the Roman army maintained its effectiveness for so many centuries. It was not only disciplined in battle but also disciplined in the ordinary details of daily life. The ability to organize something as simple as a reliable meal, day after day, year after year, helped sustain the men who guarded the empire's borders. When we imagine the Roman army, it is easy to focus on the dramatic scenes of history. The clash of shields, the march of legions across distant landscapes, the triumphs celebrated in Rome itself. But behind those moments stood countless ordinary evenings inside forts and camps. Evenings when soldiers sat together after long hours of work. Evenings when grain was ground into flour and bread baked beside small fires. Evenings when simple stews were shared, and the men who served together found a brief moment of rest before the next day's duties began. Those quiet meals rarely appear in ancient histories, yet they were repeated thousands of times across the Roman world. And in their steady, humble rhythm, they sustained the soldiers whose labor helped shape the course of Roman history. In the end, when historians step back and look at the Roman army as a whole, the question of what Roman soldiers ate becomes a surprisingly powerful way to understand how the empire functioned. Food may seem like a small detail compared to battles or emperors, yet it reveals the practical foundation beneath Rome's military success. An army that could reliably feed itself was an army that could endure long campaigns, survive harsh winters on distant frontiers, and maintain discipline across generations of soldiers. What becomes clear is that the Roman military diet was never accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices about efficiency, stability, and adaptability. Grain formed the center of those choices because it was widely available, easy to store, and capable of sustaining large populations. Around that foundation, other foods, legumes, meat, cheese, olive oil, vegetables, and occasional fruit created a diet that balanced practicality with nutritional variety. This structure allowed the Roman army to operate in environments that varied enormously. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Northern Europe, Roman soldiers faced different climates, landscapes, and agricultural systems. Yet their basic diet could adapt without losing its essential form. Grain could be transported long distances or grown locally. Meat could come from livestock raised nearby. Vegetables and herbs could be cultivated in small gardens around forts. This balance between standardization and flexibility was one of the quiet strengths of Roman administration. It allowed a single military system to function across territories that stretched for thousands of miles. Wherever a Roman fort appeared, the same basic rhythms followed: grain stored in granaries, rations distributed to soldiers, food prepared within small contubernarian groups, and meals shared at the end of the day's duties. Archaeological discoveries continue to reinforce this picture. From the remains of ovens and grinding stones to the bones and seeds preserved in ancient rubbish pits, the physical evidence of Roman military food culture appears across the empire. These fragments of everyday life allow historians to reconstruct the routines that sustained Roman soldiers long after the written records have faded. The written sources that survive also reveal how important food was in the thinking of Roman commanders. Military leaders paid close attention to supply lines and agricultural resources when planning campaigns. An army that lost access to its food could quickly lose its strength. Roman generals therefore considered the availability of grain and livestock as carefully as they considered terrain or enemy movements. This practical awareness shaped the geography of Roman expansion. Roads, river routes, and supply depots were designed not only to move soldiers but also to move food. Ports and warehouses supported the steady flow of grain across the Mediterranean and into the interior provinces. Frontier forts were positioned in locations where they could access both defensive advantages and reliable food sources. At the same time, the Roman army's food system depended heavily on the cooperation of civilian communities. Farmers produced the grain that filled military granaries. Merchants transported goods across long distances. Craftsmen made the tools and containers used to store and cook food. Local markets near forts allowed soldiers to supplement their rations with additional ingredients. In this sense, the Roman military diet connected the army directly to the economic life of the empire. The presence of thousands of soldiers in a province created steady demand for agricultural products. This demand encouraged farmers to expand production and traders to develop new supply routes. Over time, entire regional economies could grow around the needs of nearby garrisons. Food also reveals something about the cultural life of the Roman army. Soldiers came from many different regions of the empire, bringing their own traditions and tastes with them. As these men served together, their culinary habits blended with local foods available in the provinces where they were stationed. This mixing of traditions created a shared military food culture that was both Roman and provincial at the same time. A soldier from Italy might find himself eating bread made from local grains in Britain, drinking beer produced by nearby communities, and cooking meat from livestock raised in frontier farms. Yet he might also continue using olive oil imported from the Mediterranean or drinking wine transported from distant vineyards. These combinations illustrate how Roman culture moved and adapted across the empire. For the soldiers themselves, however, these larger cultural and logistical systems were rarely visible in daily life. What they experienced was the simple routine of receiving rations, preparing meals with their companions, and eating after the day's work was done. The complexity of imperial administration faded into the background of these ordinary moments. And yet, those moments were essential. The Roman army could only function if its soldiers remained healthy, disciplined, and physically capable of enduring the demands placed upon them. Reliable food made that endurance possible. Each meal restored energy after hours of marching, building, or training. Each meal allowed the soldier to wake the next morning ready to continue his duties. When we imagine the Roman soldier now, it may be tempting to picture the dramatic scenes that fill historical imagination. The clash of shields, the advance of legions across battlefields, the triumphal parades through the streets of Rome. But beneath those dramatic images lay something far quieter and far more constant. Day after day, in forts and camps scattered across 3 continents, Roman soldiers gathered in small groups beside cooking fires. Grain was ground into flour. Bread was baked in simple ovens. Pots of beans or lentils simmered slowly as the evening settled over the barracks. The meals were rarely elaborate. Often they were repetitive, yet they were dependable. And in that dependable rhythm, the steady preparation and sharing of simple food, the Roman army found the strength to sustain one of the longest-lasting military institutions in human history. So the story of what Roman soldiers ate is not simply about ancient meals. It is about the hidden systems that supported Roman power. It is about the ordinary routines that allowed extraordinary achievements to take place. Because long before the Roman army won its victories, it first had to sit down and eat. And in those quiet moments, repeated thousands of times across the empire, the foundations of Rome's strength were renewed again and again. As we come to the final part of this story, it becomes clear that the food of the Roman soldier was never simply about survival. It was about sustainability, about creating a system strong enough to support an army not for a single campaign, but for centuries. Few ancient states managed to maintain such a long-lasting military structure, and one of the reasons Rome succeeded was its ability to master the practical realities of everyday life. Food sat at the center of that mastery. Roman leaders understood that an army is not only a force of weapons and tactics. It is a community of people who must eat, sleep, work, and recover day after day. If those basic needs collapse, discipline collapses with them. Hunger weakens morale, spreads illness, and breaks the cohesion that soldiers rely on when facing danger. A well-fed army, on the other hand, can endure remarkable hardships. The Roman solution was not luxury but reliability. Instead of depending on rare or fragile foods, the Roman military diet focused on ingredients that were abundant, durable, and easy to manage in large quantities. Grain could be harvested in huge volumes, transported across provinces, and stored safely for long periods. Legumes added protein and nutrition while remaining inexpensive and easy to preserve. Salted meats, cheese, olive oil, and dried fruits could travel long distances without spoiling. Together, these foods formed a diet that was simple yet effective. It gave soldiers the energy needed to march long distances, dig fortifications, build roads, and fight when required. And because these ingredients were widely available throughout the Roman world, the same basic system could operate from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the cold frontiers of Britain. What is perhaps most impressive is how this system blended central organization with local flexibility. The Roman state maintained large supply networks that moved grain and other goods across provinces. At the same time, soldiers relied heavily on local markets and nearby farms to supplement their rations. This combination allowed the army to remain stable even when conditions changed. If one supply route was disrupted, local agriculture might fill the gap. If a frontier region lacked certain foods, imports could arrive through trade networks. This balance created resilience, and resilience was one of the defining strengths of Roman military power. Yet, even the most carefully organized system ultimately depended on ordinary human effort. Farmers had to plant and harvest the grain. Merchants had to transport goods along roads and rivers. Soldiers themselves had to grind flour, tend fires, and prepare meals after long days of work. The Roman army functioned because thousands of people, both civilians and soldiers, performed these small tasks reliably. In many ways, the Roman soldier's evening meal represented the final step in this vast chain of effort. By the time bread reached the table inside a barracks room, it had already passed through countless hands. Farmers had grown the grain. Laborers had transported it to storage depots. Administrators had recorded its distribution. Quartermasters had issued rations. Soldiers had carried it to their living quarters and ground it into flour. Only then did it become food. And so the Roman soldier's meal, humble as it might appear, was actually the visible end of a complex imperial system stretching across continents. When we think about Roman history, we often focus on dramatic events, famous generals, political struggles, or decisive battles. These moments certainly shaped the course of the empire. But behind every dramatic event stood the quiet, repetitive work that made those moments possible. The Roman army could not march without food. It could not guard its borders without food. It could not maintain discipline, health, or endurance without food. Every evening across the Roman world, soldiers gathered around their cooking fires. Grain was ground, bread baked, and simple stews prepared in clay pots. The meals were rarely elaborate, yet they were steady and dependable. And it was that dependability, more than any single victory, that allowed Rome's armies to endure across generations. From the first expansions of the Republic to the vast frontiers of the imperial age, Roman soldiers lived by this same rhythm. Work during the day, food in the evening, rest before the next duty began. The empire itself changed over time. Borders shifted. Emperors rose and fell. Provinces were gained and lost. But inside the barracks of Roman forts, the routine of the meal remained remarkably familiar. Bread, grain, pot of beans or lentils, perhaps some meat or cheese, and a cup of watered wine shared among companions who would stand watch together through the night. In those quiet moments, far from the grandeur of Rome itself, the strength of the empire was sustained in the simplest way imaginable. One meal at a time. Even after centuries of expansion, when Rome's frontiers stretched across vast distances, the daily food of the soldier still carried echoes of something much older, the agricultural traditions from which the Roman army itself had first emerged. Long before Rome ruled an empire, its earliest armies were made up of farmers who temporarily left their fields to defend their communities. Those men were accustomed to diets built around grain, legumes, olives, and simple bread. When Rome's military later evolved into a permanent professional force, many of those same habits remained. This continuity is one of the reasons the Roman military diet proved so resilient. It was not designed in a palace or invented by administrators. It grew out of everyday Mediterranean farming life, a system already well adapted to feeding large communities with relatively simple resources. Wheat, barley, lentils, beans, olive oil, and preserved foods had supported generations of rural households long before they supported legions. By preserving this agricultural foundation, The Roman army ensured that its diet remained practical and familiar for most recruits. A soldier arriving from a village in Italy, Gaul, or Spain would recognize many of the foods issued to him in the army. Even if the setting had changed, from a family farm to a frontier fort, the essential ingredients of daily life were often the same. This familiarity mattered. Military service could be disorienting, especially for young recruits leaving their homes for the first time. The routines of army life were strict, and the environments could be unfamiliar. Yet the act of eating bread, grinding grain, or cooking a pot of legumes provided a sense of continuity with the life many soldiers had known before enlistment. At the same time, the Roman army slowly became a place where those rural traditions encountered the diversity of the wider empire. As soldiers moved between provinces during their service, they encountered foods and agricultural practices different from those of their home regions. A recruit from the Mediterranean might discover new grains grown in colder climates. A soldier from Northern Europe might become accustomed to olive oil or Mediterranean herbs during service in the south. These encounters created subtle changes in diet over time. The Roman army did not erase regional food traditions. Instead, it often blended them. In frontier settlements, soldiers might eat bread made from imported wheat alongside locally produced meats or vegetables. In northern provinces where wine was scarce, locally brewed beverages could appear beside traditional Roman drinks. Archaeological discoveries illustrate these mixtures clearly. Excavations in Roman military settlements have uncovered imported Mediterranean products alongside foods native to the regions where the forts stood. Amphorae that once carried olive oil or wine have been found in the same layers as animal bones from local livestock and seeds from regional plants. This blending of food cultures reveals something important about life inside the Roman army. Although the military was highly structured, it was not culturally isolated. Soldiers interacted constantly with nearby communities, traders, and farmers. Markets developed around forts, offering fresh produce, meat, and other goods to soldiers with the means to purchase them. These exchanges gradually influenced both sides. Soldiers adopted some local foods, while local populations encountered Roman culinary habits through trade and contact with the garrison. Over time, these interactions contributed to the cultural connections that helped hold the empire together. The role of veterans also played a part in this process. After completing their years of service, Roman soldiers were often granted land in the provinces where they had served. These retired soldiers settled into local communities, bringing with them the habits they had developed during military life. Their farms sometimes combined Roman agricultural practices with local traditions, further blending cultures across the empire. Food, in this way, became part of the quiet spread of Roman influence, not through force or command, but through everyday habits carried by individuals who had spent years living and eating within the army. Yet despite these cultural exchanges, the basic structure of the Roman soldier's meal remained consistent. Grain continued to form the core of the diet. Legumes added nourishment and variety. Meat appeared when available, often preserved with salt. Olive oil, cheese, and herbs provided flavor and additional calories. Wine or vinegar water accompanied many meals. This pattern endured because it worked. It was simple, reliable, and adaptable to different environments. Most importantly, it sustained the physical demands placed on Roman soldiers, whose daily lives required endurance as much as skill with weapons. When historians consider why the Roman army remained effective for such a long period, they often focus on training, discipline, and organization. All of those factors were certainly important, but beneath them lay something more basic. An army marches, works, and fights on the strength of the food it consumes. For Roman soldiers, that food was rarely extravagant. It was the bread baked from ground grain, the pot of beans simmering beside a barracks fire, the piece of cheese or salted meat shared among companions. These meals were prepared with simple tools, using ingredients that could be grown, stored, and transported across the vast Roman world. And yet from those modest meals came the energy that sustained long marches, the endurance that built roads and fortifications, and the strength that allowed legions to stand their ground on distant frontiers. So when we imagine the Roman army now, we can look beyond the armor and the banners for a moment. We can picture the quieter scene repeated thousands of times across the empire. Evenings settling over a fort, soldiers gathered around small fires, the steady turning of a grinding stone, the smell of bread rising from an oven, and the calm conversation of men sharing food after a demanding day. In that simple moment, grain becoming bread, bread becoming strength, the daily life of the Roman soldier continued. And through that quiet continuity, the empire itself endured. By the later centuries of the Roman Empire, the habits surrounding food in the army had become so ingrained that they formed part of the identity of Roman military life itself. A soldier did not simply fight for Rome. He lived according to a set of routines that shaped how he marched, worked, rested, and ate. These routines created a rhythm that stretched across thousands of miles and many generations of soldiers. Whether stationed along the windswept frontier of Britain, guarding the desert roads of Syria, or patrolling the riverbanks of the Danube, the basic experience of a Roman soldier's daily meal remained surprisingly familiar. Part of the reason for this consistency was that Roman military leaders understood something fundamental about long-term power. Stability comes from predictable systems. An empire that could not feed its soldiers could not protect its borders. And so food logistics were treated with the same seriousness as fortifications or military training. Grain supplies were counted, roads maintained, granaries protected, and transport networks organized so that soldiers would rarely face the chaos of empty storage rooms. Yet the success of this system did not rest only on administrators or commanders. It also depended on the habits of the soldiers themselves. Roman soldiers were trained to take responsibility for their own equipment, their own living space, and even part of their own food preparation. This expectation of self-sufficiency helped ensure that the army remained adaptable in difficult conditions. If a supply convoy was delayed or a campaign moved into unfamiliar territory, soldiers still possessed the basic skills needed to grind grain, cook simple meals, and manage their rations carefully. These habits also reinforced discipline. The Roman army believed strongly in the value of routine. When soldiers performed the same essential tasks every day, marching in formation, maintaining weapons, building camps, preparing food, they developed a rhythm that kept the entire force organized. Even something as ordinary as grinding grain or tending a cooking fire became part of this larger structure of discipline. For the individual soldier, these routines often blurred together into the steady passage of years. A recruit might join the army in his late teens or early 20s and remain in service for 2 decades. During that time, he would march along countless roads, construct many camps, and share thousands of meals with the same companions in his contubernum. The repetition of these shared experiences built deep bonds between soldiers, bonds that were essential when the time came to face danger. Meals were one of the moments when these bonds became most visible. At the end of a long day of labor or patrol duty, soldiers gathered around the hearth inside their barracks room. Grain was ground into flour, water added, and bread or porridge prepared in simple clay pots. The meal might include beans, lentils, or perhaps pieces of salted meat. Olive oil might be poured over the food when available, and wine diluted with water passed between companions. There was little ceremony in these meals, yet they carried meaning. Food marked the transition from the strict duties of the day to a brief period of rest. It was a moment when soldiers could speak freely with one another, share news from home, or discuss rumors moving through the army. In a life governed by commands and schedules, the shared meal allowed for a small measure of personal connection. Sometimes these conversations included stories from distant provinces. Roman legions were often composed of men from many regions of the empire, and their conversations reflected this diversity. One soldier might describe the vineyards of southern Gaul, another the farms of the Italian countryside, and another the markets of a Greek city far to the east. Around the cooking fire, these different experiences came together in a single shared environment. Food itself often carried traces of those distant places. A loaf of bread baked from grain harvested in a nearby field might be eaten with olive oil that had traveled across the Mediterranean. Salted meat might come from livestock raised in the surrounding countryside, while wine might have been transported along trade routes that connected provinces hundreds of miles apart. Even the simplest meal, therefore, contained ingredients drawn from both local landscapes and distant regions of the empire. This blending of local and imperial resources was one of the quiet strengths of Roman organization. Instead of relying entirely on distant supply routes, the army used a combination of centralized logistics and local agriculture. Farmers near forts could sell their harvests to the garrison, while traders delivered goods that connected frontier communities to the broader Roman economy. Over time, these interactions transformed many frontier zones into thriving settlements where soldiers and civilians lived side by side. The presence of a Roman fort often brought stability to a region. Roads were maintained, markets developed, and agriculture expanded to meet the demands of the garrison. Soldiers became regular customers for local food producers, and nearby communities benefited from the reliable demand created by military life. In this way, the daily meals of Roman soldiers helped shape the economic life of entire regions. Yet, despite the complexity of these systems, the meal itself remained humble. Bread, grain porridge, beans, cheese, and preserved meat did not resemble the lavish banquets sometimes described in Roman literature. Those banquets belonged to the wealthy elite. The Roman soldier's meal was far closer to the diet of ordinary workers and farmers across the empire. And perhaps that simplicity was part of its strength. Because the diet was based on common, widely available foods, it could be reproduced almost anywhere. Roman armies did not require rare ingredients or elaborate preparation. They required food that could be grown in large quantities, stored safely, and cooked with simple tools. This practicality allowed the Roman army to operate for long periods in remote areas where other ancient forces might have struggled. A sack of grain carried by a soldier, combined with access to water and a small fire, was enough to sustain him for days. Multiply that system by thousands of soldiers, supported by organized supply routes, and the result was a military force capable of extraordinary endurance. When modern historians examine the success of Roman expansion, they often point to strategy, engineering, and discipline. All of these elements played crucial roles. But beneath them all lay the quieter infrastructure of everyday survival, the roads that carried food, the granaries that protected it, and the soldiers who prepared their meals each evening after a day's labor. In the fading light of countless Roman forts, across landscapes stretching from the Atlantic to the Near East, the same simple scene unfolded again and again. Fires flickered in the barracks. Grinding stones turned slowly as grain became flour. Clay pots simmered with humble stews. Soldiers sat together, sharing bread and conversation before the watch of the night began. Empires are often remembered through their greatest victories. Yet those victories are sustained by far more ordinary moments. For the Roman army, one of those moments was the evening meal, a modest gathering of soldiers around a cooking fire, where the strength to guard an empire was quietly renewed, one loaf of bread at a time. If we step back one final time and look at the Roman soldier's diet from the widest possible perspective, it becomes clear that food was one of the invisible structures that held the Roman world together. Histories of Rome often focus on emperors, political intrigue, dramatic battles, or the rise and fall of great leaders. Yet none of those stories could exist without the quieter systems that supported the daily lives of the people who served the empire. Among those systems, the ability to feed an army reliably may have been one of the most important. Across the Roman world, from the Mediterranean coastlines to the distant northern frontiers, soldiers depended on a chain of cooperation that stretched far beyond the walls of any single fort. Farmers planted fields and harvested grain that would eventually travel to military depots. Traders and transport workers carried sacks of wheat, amphorae of oil, barrels of wine, and preserved foods along roads, rivers, and sea routes. Administrators recorded shipments and organized storage in granaries built with careful engineering. Quartermasters distributed rations to soldiers who then carried the food into their own small living quarters. Each part of that chain had to function smoothly for the final step to happen, the moment when a soldier sat down to eat. For the men living inside Roman forts, the meal was both ordinary and essential. It did not resemble the luxurious banquets described in the writings of wealthy Romans. Instead, it reflected the values that shaped military life: simplicity, reliability, and practicality. Bread made from freshly ground grain formed the center of most meals. Beans or lentils simmered in clay pots added nourishment and flavor. Cheese, salted meat, or fish might appear depending on availability. Olive oil and herbs sometimes enriched the food, and diluted wine or vinegar water accompanied the meal. These ingredients were not chosen for elegance. They were chosen because they worked. They could survive long journeys without spoiling. They could be stored in large quantities inside granaries. They could be prepared with minimal equipment by soldiers who had already spent long hours performing other duties. That practicality made the Roman military diet remarkably durable. The same basic pattern of food could sustain soldiers in many different climates and landscapes. On the cold frontiers of northern Europe, meat and animal fat might appear more frequently to provide extra calories. In the warmer Mediterranean provinces, olive oil, vegetables, and lighter grain dishes might play a larger role. But the foundation remained the same. This balance between consistency and adaptation allowed the Roman army to operate across territories that varied enormously in geography and culture. Wherever a legion traveled, it carried with it a familiar system of food supply and preparation. Granaries, mills, ovens, and cooking pots appeared inside forts built thousands of miles apart. Soldiers trained in one province could transfer to another and still recognize the routines that structured their daily meals. Those routines did more than feed the body. They also reinforced the discipline and unity of the army itself. The shared responsibility of preparing food within the Cantaburnium strengthened the small social groups that formed the backbone of Roman military organization. 8 soldiers living together depended on each other for everything, from guarding the fort to cooking the evening meal. Grinding grain, tending the fire, and dividing portions fairly became small acts of cooperation that mirrored the teamwork required in battle. In this way, food helped build the bonds that allowed Roman units to function as cohesive forces. The soldiers who shared bread together in the evening were the same men who would stand side by side on the ramparts or march together across unfamiliar terrain. Food also linked the army to the wider society of the empire. Markets near military forts supplied fresh produce, meat, and other goods to soldiers with the means to purchase them. Farmers benefited from the steady demand created by garrisons. Traders carried Mediterranean products, wine, olive oil, dried fruit, into distant frontier regions. Through these exchanges, the daily meals of Roman soldiers helped weave economic connections across the empire. Even cultural exchange flowed through these quiet interactions. Soldiers stationed far from home encountered new foods and cooking styles from local populations. Over years of service, they often adopted some of these traditions while continuing to maintain familiar Roman habits. When veterans eventually settled in the provinces after retirement, they carried these blended food cultures with them, contributing to the gradual integration of Roman and local traditions. Seen from this perspective, the Roman soldier's meal was more than nourishment. It was a small point where agriculture, trade, culture, and military organization all came together. And yet, for the soldier himself, the experience remained simple. At the end of a long day, after drills, patrols, or construction work, he returned to the barracks where his Cantaburnium waited. A hand mill turned slowly as grain became flour. Water heated in a clay pot over the fire. Bread baked in the oven or porridge simmered gently as the evening air cooled outside the fort walls. Conversation drifted through the room. Some soldiers spoke of their homes far away. Others discussed rumors moving through the legion or news brought by travelers and traders. The meal was not grand, but it was steady, and that steadiness mattered. Because tomorrow the routine would begin again. The gates of the fort would open at dawn. Soldiers would march out to their duties, whether guarding a frontier road, repairing defenses, or escorting supplies through the countryside. And at the end of that day, once again, they would return to the familiar work of preparing food together. It is easy to overlook such ordinary scenes when thinking about ancient history. But the truth is that empires are sustained not only by victories or leaders, but by the everyday routines that allow thousands of people to continue their work day after day. For Rome, those routines included the simple act of feeding its soldiers. Bread ground from grain, beans simmered in a pot, a cup of watered wine shared among companions. From these humble meals came the strength that carried Roman legions across continents, guarded distant frontiers, and maintained one of the longest-lasting military systems in the ancient world. And so, when we ask what Roman soldiers ate, the answer tells us more than just a list of foods. It reveals the quiet foundation of Roman power: one meal, one routine, and one disciplined day at a time. And so, as we reach the end of this story, the question we started with, what did Roman soldiers eat, turns out to reveal far more than a simple list of foods. It opens a quiet window into the daily life of one of the most disciplined military forces the ancient world ever knew. Because the Roman army was not sustained by glory alone. Behind every famous march, every fortified frontier, and every battlefield victory stood thousands of ordinary routines repeated day after day. Among the most important of those routines was the evening meal. It was the moment when the soldier stepped away from drills, guard duty, construction work, and long patrols. It was when the noise of the fort softened into the steady rhythm of grinding grain, tending fires, and preparing simple food. The meal itself was rarely elaborate. Bread made from ground wheat or barley remained the foundation. Pots of beans or lentils provided nourishment and warmth. Cheese, salted meat, or fish might appear when supplies allowed. Olive oil added richness, herbs offered flavor, and diluted wine or vinegar water accompanied the food. Simple ingredients, familiar preparation, reliable nourishment. Yet behind that simplicity stood the enormous machinery of the Roman world. Grain had been planted and harvested in distant fields. Merchants had transported goods across roads and rivers. Granaries had protected the harvest from weather and pests. Administrators had measured rations and distributed supplies. Soldiers themselves had carried sacks of grain, turned the heavy grinding stones, and baked the bread that now lay before them. By the time a Roman soldier sat down to eat, an entire system had already done its work. And that system was one of the quiet reasons Rome endured for so long. Empires are often remembered through their most dramatic moments: battles, conquests, triumphs, and the rise of powerful leaders. But those moments are only possible when the everyday foundations of life remain stable. An army cannot march without food. It cannot build roads, defend walls, or guard distant frontiers if its soldiers are hungry. Rome understood this with remarkable clarity. Rather than rely on luxury or excess, the Roman military diet was built on reliability. Grain could be stored, transported, and prepared almost anywhere. Legumes added strength to the meal. Preserved foods ensured survival through difficult seasons. Together, these elements created a diet capable of sustaining soldiers through years of service and across enormous distances. But perhaps the most important part of the Roman soldier's meal was not the food itself. It was the act of sharing it. Inside the barracks, the cantaburnium, the small group of 8 soldiers who lived together, formed a kind of temporary household. These men marched together, worked together, stood watch together, and prepared their meals side by side. Over time, the simple routine of cooking and eating built bonds of trust that would later matter on the battlefield. When they gathered around their evening fire, the soldiers were not thinking about imperial logistics or economic networks. They were simply resting, eating, and speaking with the companions who had become part of their daily lives. And in that quiet moment, the vast empire beyond the fort walls seemed very far away. Outside, the frontier stretched into forests, deserts, mountains, or open plains. Roads ran toward distant cities. Trade routes carried goods across seas and rivers. Governors governed provinces, and emperors ruled from the capital. But inside the barracks, the scene was much simpler. A grinding stone turning slowly, a clay pot simmering above a small fire, bread being divided among tired men who had spent the day in service to Rome. The meal might not have looked impressive to an outsider. It lacked the extravagance of elite Roman banquets or the spectacle of public feasts in great cities. Yet that modest meal carried enormous significance, because every time a Roman soldier ate, he regained the strength needed to continue his duty the next day. And that quiet cycle, work, food, rest, and return to duty, was repeated across hundreds of forts, thousands of soldiers, and many generations of service. It was repeated in Britain's cold northern winds, along the wide rivers of Central Europe, in the deserts of the Near East, and across the fertile lands of North Africa. Day after day, year after year, century after century. So when we imagine the Roman army now, we can picture not only the shining armor and disciplined formations that fill the pages of history. We can also imagine the quieter scene that sustained them. Evening settling over a Roman fort, the smoke of cooking fires drifting into the air, the steady sound of grain being ground into flour, and a group of soldiers, sitting together in the dim light of the barracks, sharing a simple meal that would carry them through another day of guarding the empire. Not a grand moment, not a famous victory, just bread, beans, and the quiet strength of routine. And sometimes, in history, that is exactly what holds the world together.